Good evening. The Browne Institute for Media Innovation is delighted to welcome you to our winter quarter speaker series with tonight's guest, New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet. I'm Ann Grimes, Associate Director of the Browne Institute for Media Innovation. As a veteran journalist who previously worked for some of Dean's key competitors, I'm excited, as I know you are, to hear from Dean about the current state of the media. Before we start, let me say a quick word about the Browne Institute. For those of you who don't know, the Browne Institute for Media Innovation is a collaboration between Stanford and Columbia universities designed to encourage and support new endeavors in media innovation, both in developing new media technologies and new ways of telling stories. Browne is a bi-coastal institute. At Stanford, it is anchored in the School of Engineering. At Columbia, at the Graduate School of Journalism. The institute was founded in 2012 through a generous gift from longtime Cosmopolitan editor Helen Gurley Brown, whose husband, the film producer David Brown, was a graduate of both universities. At Browne, we look for ideas that are original and have the potential to bring true innovation to the media world. To achieve our goals, the Institute invites the Stanford and Columbia communities to submit proposals for what we call magic grants. The name came from Ms. Brown's belief that when you bring together journalists and technologists, magic can happen. Our grants support small teams of students who bring their ideas to life by developing a prototype, creating an innovative media project, or telling stories in a new way. We have issued our call for this year's proposals. The deadline for those proposals, if you're interested, is April 9th. For more information, please check our website, brown.stanford.edu. That's brown.stanford.edu. We hope you will apply. Now, before our program gets underway, let me introduce Maneesh Agrawala, who is the director of the Browne Institute, who will in turn introduce Dean. Maneesh, in addition to being the director of the Browne Institute, is the Forrest Baskett Professor in the Department of Computer Science. Maneesh earned both his BS and PhD from Stanford. His research focuses on understanding how people communicate through audio and visual media. He is the recipient of many, many awards, including a 2009 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant. We're so delighted that you all could be with us here tonight, and let me welcome Maneesh Agrawala.
So welcome, everyone. I am delighted to introduce Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times. This is, of course, the highest ranked position in the Times newsroom, and in this role, Dean oversees the New York Times news report in all its various forms. Dean started his career in journalism at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans in 1978. In fact, I recently learned that he dropped out of college because of his passion for journalism and took this job in 78. From 1984 to 1990, he worked at the Chicago Tribune as the chief investigative reporter, and he did his first stint at the New York Times from 1990 to 2000, where he served in a variety of roles, including Metro reporter and special projects editor for the business desk. From 2000 to 2007, he was managing editor and then editor of the Los Angeles Times. And in 2007, he returned to the New York Times, where he served first as Washington bureau chief until 2011, then managing editor until 2014, and finally assumed his position as executive editor in May of 2014. Dean was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1988 for investigative work documenting corruption in the Chicago City Council, and was again a finalist for another Pulitzer in 1994 again, for investigative reporting work. So he has deep roots in journalism. Please join me in welcoming Dean Baquet to Stanford. So,
Hi.
So, as executive editor of the New York Times, I was hoping you might walk us through a typical day at work for you, the kinds of decisions that you're responsible for in making the news report.
So a typical day begins when I wake up in the morning and I look at the New York Times on my phone to see what I missed from the night before, and also just to see what it looks like on the phone. And then I look at the Washington Post on the phone defensively. I mean, I like the Washington Post, but mainly I want to see if they beat us on anything, or if they bested us in any stories. And then I do the same thing with the Journal. And then I look at assorted newsletters from Brian Stelter to Axios, et cetera, about half a dozen of those. And then I settle into the New York Times in print. The day is built around, there's a morning meeting that there's been documentaries about, where we used to start to pick the front page, but now we don't even talk about the front page. Essentially, we debate what the big stories of the day are going to be, the big news stories, and what enterprise stories we want to produce. And then my favorite days are the days when I'm driving that coverage through the day. If I were there now, my favorite thing to do would be to talk about how we're going to cover Gary Cohn's resignation and how we're going to make our coverage distinct from the Post and the Journal and others. And I would likely have gotten the business staff and the Washington Bureau on the phone together to talk about what the coverage looks like. That's my favorite kind of day. It's not always the kind of day I have. I'm leaving out the necessary unfun stuff of running a newsroom of 1,400 people with all the attendant personnel stuff. I mean, probably for me, the most rewarding and challenging decisions that I have to make in the course of a week are decisions like, we had a pretty full-throated discussion in the newsroom a few weeks ago. We got hold of a tape recording in which that showed the deaths of the 4 American soldiers in Niger. It's now been released widely by the people who killed them. But we got the tape, and it was made one of the are people familiar with this story? And we got the tape because one of the guys was wearing a helmet cam, and it recorded his death and the deaths of the other soldiers. And we got hold of it, and I looked at it and had to make a decision about whether or not to use it, which was challenging. First off, these are the deaths of 4 soldiers. Deaths of soldiers in wartime are bloody. The parents hadn't seen them, obviously. At that time, the Pentagon hadn't seen them. So I decided not to show them, but I decided to use them as a way to do a reconstruction of I called in the reporters and I asked the question. I'm describing my good days. I'm living out my bad days. Where I would sit down. I sat down with the Washington Bureau and the foreign staff, and I said, I would like us to tell the story of how 4 young boys ended up in a country that most Americans have never heard of, and how they ended up dying, how the Pentagon failed them, which the Pentagon did, and what is it about our broad foreign policy that allowed this to happen. And we spent 2 weeks working on that story and chose not to show the video, but to use to describe it based on the video. So my ideal week, or the week where I have to wrestle with those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. And I can only imagine that there are many challenging decisions that you have to make every day. It's a very interesting time for media now. Technology companies, one could argue, are behaving more like media companies. Mm-hmm. Media companies are, in turn, behaving more like technology companies. Mm-hmm. Legacy media faces all kinds of challenges with its business model, particularly newspapers. Mm-hmm. Trust in the media has, of course, eroded substantially. Journalism, especially investigative journalism, has been hard hit, and we have the problem of fake news these days. And so,
Should I leave now?
so what are the things that you worry about most?
A lot of stuff. Some of them things on that list. Some of them other things. I mean, I worry about. I mean, the struggle of a modern newspaper editor. And I shouldn't even think of myself just as a newspaper editor. The struggles of a modern editor revolve around what things you should hold on to that are bedrock principles, and what things you should understand are merely habits, if you will. And that sounds easy, but it's the hardest part of my job. Print, as much as I love it, created habits, many of which are good, but not all of them. Some of them are just habits that probably were created when print was considered the technology of the day, the way the phone is today. And understanding which of those things you can change and which things you just can't change, that they're part of our DNA, is tricky. I mean, I believe you can change the way you write a story. I think that we write stories the way we write them because that made sense in the print era. So I think that struggle, that is the most profound struggle I'm engaged in. I'm loath to, I hate the phrase fake news. I'm loath to say that's a dominant issue because I think that while it's important and it probably had some impact on the last presidential election, I think that that the answer for us to combat quote unquote fake news is to win the trust of our readers by being completely accurate, totally independent, and much more transparent than we ever were. Transparent in telling people who our reporters are, transparent in telling them how we get stories, transparent in saying when we screw up, and just having the kind of relationship with our readers where we don't do what I grew up doing. I grew up as a newspaper journalist, not sharing anything with readers. I actually remember as a 20-year-old reporter for the New Orleans State-Times answering the phone, and it was a reader on the phone, and I remember thinking, oh my God. And I'm sure I just hung up on him. Like, what? Why are you bothering me? I have editors to answer to. You know?
So I want to come back to trust and transparency, but maybe let's start with print and some of the differences from print. What are some of the specific writing types of differences that you're seeing between print and online journalism and so on?
My own view is that the way we write for print, having spent most of my life writing that way, is often artificial and makes no sense, and we forgot why we do it that way. The pyramid style, which was the most important thing at the top, and the fact that all news stories were uniform in their structure, which I think we all thought of as the way to do business. The only reason all news stories are uniform in their structure in newspapers, in most newspapers, is because if you had 50 people filing on deadline at 9 o'clock at night, and you wrote one way, I chose iambic pentameter, you chose an anecdotal lead with a little flourish in the middle, and somebody else over here, the system would just crash. The only reason that everybody writes the same way in newsrooms, in newspapers, is because of that manufacturing format. And for people like me who started in newspapers at 19, it took a long time to learn to write that way. It's not a natural way of writing. In fact, it doesn't exist in sports. Sports traditionally is where the best writing in newspapers was. Their demands were different. Their deadline demands were just for the game story, and all the game stories looked exactly the same, but they had a lot more room to play with other kinds of stories, and that's why some of the best historic writing in newspapers is in sports. But that way of writing is not, we don't have to do that. We don't have to do that now.
And are there specific things that you've experimented with at the Times in these different forms of writing?
More first person. Not, and we've screwed this up sometimes. I'm not looking for gratuitous me first person. I'm not interested in hearing how the congressional reporter, which subway she went on to get to the. But we just did a takeout this weekend that I thought was just a wonderful example of transparency. It was a story of a young woman who went to Williams College, who was homeless, and she died on the streets of New York. And the reporter put himself in it in a way that made him a human being. It wasn't like, here's me and here's how I told the story. He told you a little bit about how he stumbled on the story. He met somebody who used to take care of the woman on the street who would bring her things. He described, it just made you feel like he was an empathetic figure trying to understand this woman's life. And I think that made the story really powerful. That's one way. The other way is that the goal now is when we go into a story, and I'm making this sound all so simple, right? We produce 200 or 300 stories a day, and mostly it's messy. So I'm talking about the unmessy moments, rare unmessy moments. You ask the question, what's the best way to tell a story? Sometimes we only tell a story with video now.
Yeah.
Sometimes we only tell a story by telling you 3 things you have to know from the story, because that's literally the best way to tell a complex story.
So the New York Times also has a very long history of investigative reporting. And this year, one of the most well-known stories in this past year was the Harvey Weinstein story that really spawned the Me Too movement. And I was wondering what some of the challenges were that you faced in launching that investigation and in understanding its impact.
The precursor of that story was a story that we did about Bill O'Reilly and some of the settlements, these unbelievable amounts of like $45 million or something like that in settlements. And I assigned 2 reporters to work on the O'Reilly story after the Roger Ailes story, because I remembered a case many years before in which a young woman had made accusations against Bill O'Reilly. I was at the LA Times at the time, so it's mid-2000s, and nobody paid attention to it. And the Roger Ailes story made me want to revisit that. So they started reporting, and it was hard to get people to talk. This is before Me Too sort of began to flourish. Hard to get women to talk. It had been humiliating. Bill O'Reilly was powerful. But we stumbled on what I think was the formula for these stories. We started to focus on settlements. And we learned that there were tons of settlements attached to these cases. In the case of Bill O'Reilly, there were many settlements. We had to convince some women and their lawyers to let us look at settlements. We had to convince them to let their friends show us settlements. And we essentially created 2 standards. We would only, in the beginning, we would only use the cases if we had a settlement or if the victim had told people contemporaneously, more than one person. So we would have to interview, she told her best friend, she told her boyfriend, she told her husband, she told her father, she told somebody. And once we created that standard, once we did the O'Reilly story and we came up with things that met that standard, we then applied that. I then called in reporters and said, we've stumbled on some. O'Reilly got fired, which knocked my socks off. I thought, I couldn't believe it. I thought, I just didn't think there would be that kind of result. And it was just clear to us that we had hit onto a major story, and we had hit onto a larger thread in society. So we assigned them to just find out other cases where this has happened. Is this like an epidemic? And it took them about a week or 2 to come back and say, there's this guy, Harvey Weinstein. And we used the same formula, settlements and women. And there was a moment, and I shouldn't give away all the drama because the 2 writers are writing a book. But screw it, I don't get to write the book. There was this wonderful moment where we heard the New Yorker was working on the same on a story. And I'm usually competitive, as were the other two editors involved, so we said, we got to put pedal to the metal. The reporters said, this story will not have the impact. And we had tons of stuff. The best thing we had was this written document from a woman, I think it was in the LA office, who described all the things he had done. And that document by itself was enough for a story. So we had a story written with that as the lead. And the two reporters, Megan and Jody, Megan Toohey and Jody Cantor, said to me, they pushed back hard. They said, we need movie stars for this story to have impact. And my thought was, we need to be first for the story to have impact. And they kept pushing, and we tugged and went back and forth, and the story was being edited. And then Jody walks into my office, as I recall it, in tears because Ashley Judd agreed to let us use her name on the record. We had movie stars, but we didn't have them on the record. And they were right. That story hit like a bomb, and this is probably, not a great testament to how society works, because there were movie stars in it. I think there were movie stars in it, and that made it resonate for people.
When did you understand the cultural importance of the story? Was it immediate, or
No, I didn't. I really didn't. I thought I didn't think it was gonna. I had no idea it would resonate that powerfully. I had no idea. We opened up a tip line shortly afterward, and then Ronan Farrow's piece ran in the New Yorker a few days later, and it was really, really good. And I remember I had an exchange with a friend of mine who works at the New Yorker, and I said, that was a really good story. And his response was, it shows how much stuff was there that you guys did a really good story, and we did a really good story, and there's no overlap. But I guess I didn't. I think it was when the tip line started to light up and people started calling up about other people. And then I think women began to trust the New York Times and the New Yorker to tell their stories, and we started hearing from so many women. Look at Louis C.K., somebody would say. Look at Matt Lauer, somebody else would say. And then people were calling other news organizations. And I think when I saw the LA Times start to write about some people, and then the Post started, I think that's when it started to hit me. This was larger. And also the numbers involving Harvey Weinstein. I mean, the numbers the cases are huge and much more dramatic than anybody thought. But I don't think I understood for a couple months that something big had hit society.
So the Times has also been experimenting with different forms of investigative journalism. In particular, we were talking earlier about some of the work that Malachy Browne has done. And I was wondering if you could describe for the audience, some of his forensic video that he
Malachy Browne is this guy who is a member. He's Irish. He's a member of our video unit, and he is, I think, I spent my life as an investigative reporter and before I became an editor. And Malachy, to me, is the modern investigative reporter. And what he does is he does forensics examinations by collecting video and mapping from places I didn't even know existed. The people who do this are able to collect social media feeds from, I've seen people do like portraits of North Korea based on the occasional social media feed, based on the occasional satellite photo, and they put these together over time to give you a snapshot of a place. The one that Malachy did, he did a lot. He reconstructs shootings, but the most dramatic thing he did, the most investigative thing he did was last year was there was when President Erdogan of Turkey was visiting Washington, some protesters assembled around the Turkish embassy, and a bunch of Turkish guards went over and beat the hell out of him on American soil in Washington near Embassy Row. And the U.S. tried to downplay it, and the Turks sort of denied that it really happened. Malachy collected all of these videos that had been taken and pulled them together and reconstructed the event in a way, I mean, go look at it. It's pretty remarkable. And he actually proved, if you looked at the stuff, that Erdogan was nearby. It was just a great piece of video investigative reporting that I didn't know anybody could do. And we're trying to build up that part of the unit. Because my own view has been that you should ask yourself, especially with an investigative story, what's the best way to tell a story? And you should sort of figure out, take off all of your limits and imagine. And that I could have put 10 reporters on the story of reconstructing what happened that day in Washington, and I would have gotten a really good story. It wouldn't have been better than what Malachy did. And it probably wouldn't have been quite as powerful as what Malachy did. And sometimes we do one and sometimes we do the other.
And it's something that probably is only possible, in the last few years.
Yes, that's right.
More and more people are collecting video and posting it and so on.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. There was I don't want to. I thought the moment I realized just what the possibilities are and how much journalism had changed. Well, there are many moments, but when I was in the newsroom running the coverage after the Paris attacks, I just thought there was so much video coming out, amateur video, live accounts of people who were tweeting what they were seeing or posting it to Facebook. There was so much stuff being thrown into the public sphere that we and other news organizations were able to not only report these events live, but show things we never would have been able to show. And the only limitation was our creativity and making this stuff available to people. And I think that remains, to my mind, the Paris attacks, for tons of reasons, from geography to timing, in terms of craft, the most well-done coverage of a breaking news story that I've seen in ages.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Trump administration. So
The what?
So, it's unlike any other administration. How has it changed the New York Times?
Can I talk about Malachy again? It's really difficult to cover him. First off, he's created tension with our readers. I mean, the readership, the audience of the New York Times skews left. I would love it to be more rounded, but it skews left right now. And they would like us to take him down, if to be frank. Which is not our role. It's not my role. My belief is that you report independently and aggressively, and you don't align yourself with anybody. I don't want to be the organ for the opposition to Donald Trump. I want to cover the hell out of him. I think if I cover the hell out of him, as in any politician, people are more likely to believe us. And secondly, if you align yourself with any one side, the rule is that other side comes back into power eventually, and then you're just sort of like the house chump, right? But he's challenging. He more openly exaggerates than any politician I've been involved in covering. I mean, I ran the Washington Bureau for a long time. He pushes the edge of truth, and we've actually used the word lie at my instigation once. He changes dramatically on big issues, much more than anything I've ever seen in covering anybody. I mean, he can have a public debate where he talks as if he is very supportive of gun control and then shift the next day. His relentless attacks on the press are not healthy for us. On the other hand, we probably know more about this president's day-to-day life and the people around him than any president I've ever been involved in covering. We used to like throw 20 reporters at the kind of stuff that happens like every day in this Trump in covering other administrations. He talks a lot. The people around him talk a lot. There's a certain amount of chaos in the White House, and there's just this is the kind of stuff that Robert Caro, who has written the great books about LBJ, is probably banging his head against the wall, because he would spend 10 years trying to find out the kind of stuff that we now know about the Trump administration every week. We know, how he tweets, when he tweets. We know what he has to say. We know who he meets with. We know every inch of the scandals around him. But it's a challenge covering him. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of tweeting, this is a president that really no longer needs to speak to the press to communicate with the public, right? He can tweet.
So his predecessors, he's done it in a different way, but his predecessor, Barack Obama also knew how to get around us. He did it very differently. He was this unbelievably eloquent speaker, and when he wanted to talk and to his constituents, he would knock us out as the middleman. Trump just does it in a more ham-handed way.
And well, how do you deal with the these tweets that come out on a regular basis?
We get notes from people who say, "How dare you cover these tweets? Why are you covering these tweets?" And he's the president of the United States, and the things he has to say have meaning and import. Even if you suspect he might change his mind the next day, the things he has to say affects allies, affects the way government works, affects how agencies do their business. To not cover them, to me, would be a political decision, right? Imagine that decision in my newsroom. Let's not cover the president because let's not cover the president's tweets because he sort of tweets too much. Don't we think? That would be like a dereliction of duty, right? That's almost a political act. Our job is to cover him. Our job is to write about him, and I think we have to cover his tweets without question. We should fact check them. We should challenge them, but we certainly have to cover them.
And what's the process like? Because they come out, sort of frequently. Do you have a team that's ready to go?
We've doubled the number of people who cover the White House because they have to work long shifts, as you can imagine. Tweet comes out. It's my turn to do the tweets today. I'm doing the morning shift, so I'm doing the tweets today, and I write about the tweets. If it happens in the evening, the person who writes who covers the evening shift does it. And we just have a lot of people covering the White House.
So another big issue that we touched on earlier was trust in the media. And this is a fairly big issue.
Yeah.
Trust seems to have eroded quite a bit.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on rebuilding that trust? What are steps that the New York Times is taking to do that?
Some of that is our fault. And I'm using the universal hour. I'm speaking for the New York Times, because that's what I care about most. But it's the press in general. We can't deny that we became elitist and a little bit arrogant. It just so happened that the papers that survived the best were in big American cities, Washington, New York, and LA for a long time. The big news organizations are on the coast. I think there are things that I've thought about this a lot. I think there are things that we weren't good at covering because of our locations. I often use religion. I said this once, and it ended up being a big news story in a religion publication that made it sound like I didn't believe in religion or something. That's not what I mean. I was an altar boy. I grew up in a very Catholic family in the South, but I live in Manhattan, and I don't see a lot of open displays of religion. I think the press sometimes, starting with the Gingrich era, didn't quite understand the rise of the religious right. If I thought about it, I should have understood it. They were very much like the Catholics who, taught me in school in New Orleans, who wanted to make the case that they should be tax exempt and they should have money, they should get money the same way the public schools did. We just didn't quite have a handle on that. So that's our fault. And I think we have to remedy that. I also think that we were not transparent enough. I think we have to show people who we are, be a little humble, show people how we do our business, show people how we create stories, show people, own up to our mistakes, show people, you should believe reporter X for the New York Times because here's their backgrounds. I think we could do that better, and I think that kind of transparency will go a long way. I think we need to diversify our newsrooms in some obvious ways. Newsrooms are still largely white and too male, but I also think we have to make sure. I just went on a program where we hired a couple at the urging of a guy named Chris Chivers, who's our Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent, former war correspondent who served in the military. He came in and said, "You guys ought to have some more people on your staff who served in the military." So I said, why did I not think of that? So we went out and hired a group of reporters who served in the military. One of them covers the Pentagon. I mean, that's a whole new thought. And one of those reporters was in the room when I had to make the decision that I described about whether or not to run that video. And boy, did I want his point of view, right? I think you diversify your staff, you are transparent about what you do, you resist the urge to swing left or right, you maintain your independence, and I know I'm making that sound easy, it's really hard, but that's what I think we have to do.
And one of the ideas in there was to tell your audiences a bit more about the writers, right? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it seems like a very interesting way to.
Yeah. So here's a classic one. I always use her as an example. There's a reporter named Alyssa Rubin who worked when I was the managing editor of the LA Times. I sent her abroad to cover the beginning of the war in Afghanistan. She covered that from the very beginning, and then she moved over and covered the invasion of Iraq. She covered Afghanistan and Iraq, beginning until she left the LA Times to go to the New York Times. And then she became the Baghdad bureau chief and the Kabul bureau chief for the New York Times. Add all that up, and she covered those wars from the very beginning. So, and she was almost killed in a helicopter crash trying to cover the refugee crisis, literally almost killed, and has risked her life and deeply understands that world. So, stupid journalist trick. She writes a 700-word story that's an analytic piece about, the Afghan elections or whatever. We just published that story with her name, Alyssa Rubin, Kabul. What are we leaving out? We're leaving out, you should believe that story because she's been covering this goddamn thing from the very beginning. We're leaving out the fact that she knows this story probably better than anybody else in the world. And I think we got to do a better job of letting readers know that. And I think all those things are the sort of the blocking and tackling you have to do to start to build some credibility among your readers.
So another thing at the Times, and other well-known things, is that you moved very consciously to this paywall model, and that has really worked out well for the New York Times. And
it probably saved the New York Times.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that decision and what the aftermath has been.
So the good news is I wasn't at the New York Times when the decision was made, so I can look at it with a little bit of distance. There was a pretty fierce debate. You have to go back in time to remember what the larger debates about news and the web. There were people who thought all information should be free. This is not the mindset in 2017 or 2018, but that was the mindset 7 or 8 years ago. Everything would be free. Everything should be free was the belief of a lot of people who were philosophical about the internet, and that in fact, that was the coolest thing about the internet, a lot of people believed. The second thing was there were a lot of business people in the world of media who believed that the way to build a revenue was to have a giant audience that would be irresistible to advertisers, right? We have more readers than we've ever had. The view then was, if you could build millions of course advertisers will come. And what the publisher had to decide was, do you take the risk that if you start to charge, you'll lose your audience? Will people run away from it, right? The good news is he had the backdrop of a still profitable print newspaper, but he was also looking at the declining profitability of the print newspaper. And meanwhile, only two other institutions were charging, the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, and those are very different institutions. Those are places where people charge their subscriptions to their expense accounts. They're just different institutions. It's a general interest publication wanting to charge. And there wasn't an expectation that the journals, which is a great news organization, I'm not questioning that, but their vision of public service is different. They serve an investor audience as well as, that's not our audience. So the publisher made the decision to do it. And I think part of it was revenues were declining so quickly in print. But if the bet was that if you gave people really powerful journalism, they'd be willing to pay. And it turned out to be right. Had it been wrong, I wouldn't have a newsroom of 1,400 people, that's for sure. It was right, and it was beautifully executed. They went into it slowly. I can give them all this credit since it had nothing to do with it. It's now the model everybody wants to duplicate, and it saved the New York Times.
And correct me if I'm wrong, this past year, digital subscriptions.
Digital has passed. When I started in the business, advertising was, as I said earlier, I think 80% of our revenue. We had so much advertising coming in the 90s. I remember we would sometimes have to take the A, and everybody wanted to be in the A section. We would have to take the A section and slice it in two. So we'd have the A section, and then we'd have a second A section. And one weekend, one Sunday, I was the national editor, and the executive editor came over to me and say, bad news, we're having to slice it in three. Now, what you don't understand is I have to produce stories to fill those sections. And they have to be stories of a certain size to fit the ads and I hit the phones and I called every goddamn reporter and I said, I need 500 words. I don't care if it's your goddamn high school poetry. I gotta have 500 words. I have to fill a section. And the publisher came in the next day after we did this, and he walked over to the editor and he said, we will never do that again. We looked really piggy. We did. But those days are gone for advertising. We now make more than half of our money from subscribers, which for my money is better.
Yeah, and digital subscriptions have surpassed print subscriptions. Is that the?
Yeah, I actually looked up the number. I don't know if digital. I can actually look. I don't have my phone with me. I will give you the exact numbers, and you can. But okay. The total subscription cost. You need more digital subscriptions because they're cheaper to make up for losses in print. But the total is about 3 million, which is like unbelievable. New York Times has never had that many subscribers. And we now have stories routinely that have, I don't even remember what the final number was for the first Harvey Weinstein story, 10 million or something like that. No, we never had that many readers for a story, never. I mean, this is like, the ability for people to find your good stuff is it's a big deal.
So I want to turn it over to questions from the audience. And we have 2 mics on the side, so you'll have to step up to one of these 2 mics, and we'll start taking questions in a moment. So please come up to those. In the meantime, I'll ask one last question, which is, we have a lot of people at Stanford that are very interested in journalism. And so, in your view, what are some of the skills that journalists should learn today to be effective journalists at a place like the New York Times?
Well, the one skill that you should learn today that you should also learn 10 years ago, et cetera, is deep curiosity and sort of a true belief in honorable inquiry, which is to go into a hard question with an open mind, and a sense of fairness. And that's not going to change. That's not going to change whether, algorithms, the next executive editor of the New York Times has a computer name. That's not good. That core stuff. But other than that, the reporter of the future is going to have to know a lot. The ideal reporter of the future will be able to dabble in more than one medium. The guy who is the star of our podcast, Michael Barbaro, was just a political reporter a few months ago. So you have to be able to do different things. You have to think visually. I'm creating the ideal robotic reporter of the future. You have to understand audience enough to find your own audience. What that means is if you are a classical music critic, you want to understand how to make sure your coverage reaches people who care deeply about classical music. You have to understand how to get that audience and how to reach that audience. I think those are the skills you need. And be a great writer, be a great investigative reporter. Half the skills are the skills that exist now. If Chris Chivers, who's the great reporter I described, came to me right now and said, Dean, what do I have to do to be a great reporter? I would say to him, do all the things you've been doing that made you a great reporter, and please don't do anything different.
Okay, let's start over here.
Thank you. I try to wrap my question into two pieces. One is when you have a president like we have and has gone through the campaign and the current time in the White House, constantly knocking you as fake news and the New York Times going out of business, have you noticed any change in the way your subscribers think of you and the number of people who still subscribe? And the second piece is one that's really more...
It's gone. The answer is it's gone. Our subscriptions have gone up dramatically, hugely dramatically.
The other part of my question was, as one who has grown up thinking about the news media as great as they were, because we were blessed to have the New York Times, the Washington Post, Walter Cronkite, these people, and I'll add Ted Koppel if I can, because I had the pleasure of just saying hello to him, and he's here in our audience tonight. When we had people like that on the national stage, there was no such thing as fake news. These people, except for an occasional stub of a toe of a reporter who went beyond the bounds of what he should do, were basically our news, our view on the world. Can you please, please, please tell me that we're going to get back to that kind of an era someday?
You always had fake news. Always. You just it didn't have a way to resonate across the country. The National Enquirer, the Weekly World, tabloid newspapers, there was always people making stuff up. They weren't making stuff up. The two differences are they weren't making stuff up toward a political aim. The National Enquirer was reporting about, three-headed whatever. They were doing it to sell subscriptions. The big difference is they're doing it for political aims. And the other big difference is they can sell it to, they can make it available to tens of millions of people. I honestly think that if what I will call the honorable news media, which includes people on the right and the left, by the way, I honestly believe that if what I call the honorable news media is transparent, the way I just described, more open. I'm here partly because I want people to understand the New York Times. Probably my predecessors wouldn't do as much of this. I teased my friend Marty Barron, who's the editor of the Post. I told him he's on the point of where he would do supermarket openings. He makes so many public appearances. He told me he does bar mitzvahs too, if anybody's got any. I think we got to get out and explain ourselves. And I just think history proves everything will be fine.
I'm a subscriber to the digital New York Times, and for several years now, and I have noticed that when I then come across a paper edition, it seems like the digital one has been abbreviated greatly. Is that just
The digital
abbreviated?
one is,
The digital one has been abbreviated.
Yeah.
I will see stories in the paper
Yeah.
one that I don't see in the digital one, and I'm wondering if that's true or how you choose what you put in, or maybe I'm just reading it incorrectly.
No, they're not abbreviated on purpose. What happens? I mean, here is the life of a story now. Gary Cohen announces, or we break the story, which is actually what happened, that he's going to step down. You get a 500-word story up, you got to move fast. Story says, Gary Cohen, the president's top financial advisor, is announced is planning on resigning because he disagrees with Trump's trade policies. You get 500 words in, 300 words, 200 words to break the story as soon as you confirm it. That story grows through the course of the night. By the time, so if you happen to look on your phone at that first story, you're seeing a 300-word story. When you get your print paper tomorrow, I haven't been in the office, but I can tell you what it's going to look like. There's going to be a 1,500-word story about Gary Cohen's resignation. There's going to be an analysis piece about, what this means for Trump. So it's not that we cut the story or make it longer. It depends on when you see the story in that cycle. Does that make sense? And it's, of course, always going to be longer in print because print is sort of like the final draft.
But it isn't just the length, it's the number of stories. There would be a story in the paper one that was not in the digital one. Is that also timing?
Yeah, it's
okay.
all a result. I mean, print deadlines versus, digital you can do all you want all day. I picked up the Journal's front page the day after the Oscars, and I felt for them because they had on their front page the pictures of Best Supporting Actor and Best Supporting Actress. Most readers don't understand what happened. They're thinking, why do they have Best Supporting? Well, I know what happened. The deadline for when he had to shut the goddamn thing down, those are the two best, and by the time Best Supporting Actor, it depends on when you see it in the cycle. We're not editing print and digital differently. We're just putting up the digital stories when we have them, essentially, in the form they're in when we're ready to publish them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask, in general, what purpose you feel a news organization should have today?
What purpose a news organization should have? I think a news organization the job of a news organization should be to do its best to give the public the information they need to make thoughtful and informed decisions. That to me is the purpose in a nutshell. I can embellish and add things, but largely that's the purpose. To make sure that if you need to make an important decision, and that ranges from, who to vote for president, that my job is to give you everything you need to make that decision, to whether or not to buy the new iPhone. That's how I see our job.
Dean, I'm Kevin Selwyn. I was a reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal for almost 20 years. I very much admire you having to do the pivoting to keep the New York Times as relevant and as aggressive as you have been. I, like you, think the fake news concept is overrated. I think your bigger issue is a question of bias and a question of what subscribers and non-subscribers believe you are attempting to do with an agenda or a perception of an agenda. And I wonder if you could talk about what your conversations are like in the newsroom as you're thinking about your public persona through that bias lens. I
think that's a good question, and I actually agree that that's a bigger issue. at least for the New York Times. I mean, others might answer it differently. I think that people, when I said earlier that I think we would be kidding ourselves if we said we did not sometimes display our elitism, and the fact that we're published in Manhattan, and the fact that most of our staff, it feels odd for me to have to be thought of as elite. I grew up my mother had a third grade education. My father didn't graduate from high school, and now suddenly I'm one of the princelings of the elite. It feels a little weird. But I do think it's a legitimate criticism that news organizations like the New York Times appear to lean left. I could quibble, by the way, with some of that. Obviously, we're pro-capitalism. We have a business section. The editorial page publishes conservative voices and is trying to do more. But I think that's a fair issue that we have to wrestle with. I don't want an audience that's only on the left. I want an audience that just cares about journalism and news. I have a weird theory, by the way, about why newspapers struggle with this, including the New York Times. It used to be that newspapers did like 30 things. And of the 30, maybe 25 had anything to do with political allegiances. So, when I was a kid, the newspaper told you whether it was going to rain that day. Whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, it told you whether it was going to rain and whether you'd had to have an umbrella. It told you whether your college team won or lost, whether your favorite player scored 20 points or 15. It told you who got shot down the street. It told you who the city council voted for. All of those things got taken away, or we gave them away. If you have to read the New York Times to know whether your team won, you're like the only person who reads the New York Times to know whether your team won. Bleacher Report can tell you better, faster, and minute by minute. There's a Weather Channel. All the things we did that were completely neutral, that newspapers did, all got taken away by competitors. The place you went to find a job, the want ads, all that stuff just got taken away, leaving us with the things that are the most contentious things we cover. And I don't think we've always done a good job sort of working hard enough to keep that coverage balanced. Does that make sense?
It does. One thing that I think about is, especially when you have your reporters on Twitter, where retweets and
Absolutely.
comments are a really biased
We just put in a new
landmine.
We just put in a new policy because my journalists on Twitter were making me nuts. First off, look, most of my staff is in New York. I'm not going to lie and tell people that the staff of the New York Times does not lean left. There are people who live in Manhattan and LA and San Francisco. But I believe that we have a structure in place that does not let that affect the news report. Twitter and social media in general, I was really upset. And I walked in one day and I said, I had just seen one editor say something outrageous about the new education secretary, and another editor or a writer say something outrageous about Donald Trump. And I called everybody and said, we need a policy. I can't have this. I can't have a situation where I have a billion editors running around making sure we're fair, and everybody goes out, has a glass of wine and starts having at it. So I agree.
Thank you.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about how this era in journalism is changing the relationship between the business and editorial sides of your paper?
Yeah. Significantly. When I grew up in newsrooms, the business side was only advertising. There was circulation. I never thought of circulation as the business side, right? I always thought of circulation as, when I ran the LA Times, the circ director would come in and say, we have a bonus day next Sunday in Orange County. And I would think, well, great, that's when I'm going to run my profile of the new Orange County, public official, because I want that story read in Orange County. But mostly the business side was advertising. And the wall between us was to keep them from influencing our coverage. The business side is not just advertising anymore. It's a whole world of people who do things that are hardly business side. They're technologists and product executives who try to help us figure out how to make the phone present well, how to figure out these thorny issues about how to place stories and where we should place stories. Not the journalistic part of where we should place stories, but literally where do you put a story in a feed when your feed is that big. And those relationships are very different than they were with advertising. I want to talk to them because they're helping me solve my problems. So in that sense, the relationship has gotten closer. But in terms of revenue, I came in as editor of the New York Times when the New York Times' finances were perilous. And I did believe, and still do believe, that the newsroom has an obligation to play a leading role in the company. And I think, that does not mean I want to play a leading role in selling ads or driving revenue, but it did mean that I couldn't do what I wish I could have done if I'd become editor 40 years ago, which was to, go off in the corner and call the revenue guys every few months and say, will you bring my money? I'd like it in 20s this time. I'm not the first one to do that. The biggest revolutionary editor I know of was Abe Rosenthal, who faced a New York Times that had dwindling circulation, dwindling revenue, the rise of television, people moving to the suburbs, and it was a crisis that probably felt a little bit like this one. And what he did was he created a paper that was not only 2 sections, but 4 sections. He brought livelier stuff to the paper. He created all the feature sections that we now take for granted, and they saved the New York Times then. And I felt like I was at the same kind of moment.
Thank you.
I have a couple of quick questions. One is, I believe it was Politico that broke the story about Tom Price and his private jets, and then they did sort of a deeper piece on how they got the story, and I think that was fabulous.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of the New York Times doing that, one? And the second is, how do you deal with, I guess this is a messy day for you, when your newsroom staff is upset at the editorial page and they air it publicly? How do you deal with that?
On the first one, we have done that. We've done accounts of how we did the Harvey Weinstein story. We actually run a feature most days in print. It's on A2 that describes the background of how we did stories and how they came to be, and or reporters write about the difficulties of covering things. I think a lot of that you should try to do within the story and within the actual coverage, but we do it a lot, and we can't do it enough. Without, you don't want to look. I don't want the newsroom to look like a marketing department. I don't, but I think it's important to tell people how we do some really ambitious stories. On the editorial page, and most people, I always remind people of this because people don't. Shocking to me, people don't know this. I don't run the editorial page. I run everything but. I don't run the editorials or the column. Paul Krugman, Maureen, Charles Blow, they don't work for me. All that said, I really support what he's trying to do. I think what he's trying to do, James Bennett, who's the editor, the opinion editor, who runs the editorial page, and the columnists who write on the op-ed page, I really support what he's trying to do. Essentially what he's trying to do, and it's been done before, is he came in and he said, I have a very liberal editorial page where we state the opinions of the New York Times, and most of my columnists are liberals who agree with my editorial page. How interesting is that? Not that interesting. And also, he said, what I've said here, none of us quite had a handle on how angry the electorate was before the last presidential campaign. So what James is trying to do is to make sure there are different, thoughtful voices who have a different point of view than the editorial page. That's why he hired Bret Stephens. I understand that some people in my newsroom don't like it. You know, I think that that's the essence of journalism, is inquiring and understanding what other thoughtful people have to say. I don't think James would hire Richard Spencer. But Bret Stevenson is a mainstream, conservative, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who came from the Wall Street Journal and is a member of the Pulitzer Board. That's like as establishment as it gets. I completely support what he's trying to do. What we could have done differently, getting back to transparency, I think my generation of editors and James' generation of editors always assume you understand what we're trying to do, right? We always do this. And I think we could have explained it. But I think, and I've said this to my staff, I've said it newsroom-wide, I support what he's trying to do. He's doing the right thing.
Thank you.
Hi, Dean. My name's Ash. I'm actually going to be joining the Times as an intern this summer.
That's great.
Yeah.
So you get to ask a really soft question.
My question is actually about Glenn.
Don't ask an HR question. Don't ask. You want to know what your benefits are going to be, right?
It's about Glenn Thrush. I was
Yeah.
actually wondering, like, what was your rationale behind keeping him on staff and moving him to a different beat, and then
Yeah.
also what the reception was from the newsroom?
Yeah. See, that's an example where we could have been more transparent. We were transparent. Stupid editor tricks. This is my fault. We were transparent when people started to criticize us. We should have been transparent from the start. So Glenn Thrush, for people who don't know, was a White House correspondent who was accused in a long piece in, I guess, Vox of, it was harassment of women who were not his subordinates, which is not a small matter, right? I mean, that's part of the equation. As soon as the piece came out, I assigned a newsroom investigator, a lawyer. She's actually not a lawyer, but she works directly for me to, like the day it came out, to investigate, to re-report the Vox piece, and also go into the Washington Bureau and just do a deep, open, put up a shingle. Come talk to me if you want to talk about Glenn. She talked to a couple dozen of people, and then she wrote a memo to me. And I decided that the way to do this fairly was I assembled a disparate group of senior editors, and I made sure it was truly disparate. It was like 10 senior editors, 11 senior editors, 6 women and 5 men, 2 people of color. Some people knew Glenn, some people didn't. And I chaired it, but I didn't express my view, because I actually didn't have a view at that point. And we spent 2 days debating it. We also talked to Glenn's colleagues, people who cover the White House with him, and tried to get a sense of what they wanted. And almost everybody thought he should not be fired in the Bureau. Men and women who worked closely with him. They thought we should come up with a punishment, but they didn't think he should be fired. Once we were done with our 2 days of debates, that's where the group was too. I went to the publisher, who's the person who has the right to overrule me if he wants to. I explained to him this whole process, and he thought it was a fair process. So we decided to suspend him and to take him off the White House. Taking somebody off the White House who has aspired to cover the White House for years, covering the White House is the premier political job, I think, in American journalism. Taking him off the White House was a significant punishment, and we suspended him. He himself said he had a drinking problem and went into rehab. And then I went into groups of people in the newsroom and I explained how I made the decision. Everything I just told you, I should have said the first day. I was mindful of Glenn's privacy. I was mindful of the privacy of the people we talked to, but I should have been more mindful of how it would be received by people. For the most part, when I described everything I just described, the reaction was, okay, I just wanted to know that you went through some pain in making this decision. I changed his beat. I put him on covering the poverty agencies in Washington, not because I think that's a lesser beat. It's because I asked myself the question, what do we need covered that Glenn would be good at that we're not covering? And he just had his first front page story about Ben Carson, and he broke the story about Ben Carson's dining table. And I think that, you know, having started the Me Too movement in a lot of ways, we were really being scrutinized, but I don't think you make decisions like that. I think that would have been a cop-out. The cop-out decision would have been, holy shit, we want to win our prizes and we want to show people, and I just think that's not, I don't think that was the way to lead in this case. So once I describe that to people, some people say to me they disagree, and I get it. I understand it. It was a difficult decision, but I think we, at least the process was fair and honorable.
Thanks, Dean. Hope to see you around.
We wear tuxedos in the newsroom, just so you know. Thank you.
You already mentioned videos a little bit, but I was wondering.
Say it again?
You already mentioned videos a little bit, but
Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you think the role of video-based storytelling is changing? And how is it going to change at the New York Times, in journalism in general?
Yeah. You know, there was this gold rush for videos where everybody was looking for every new, you know, shiny new revenue possibility, and everybody went nuts over video. Oh my God, if we create a lot of video streams, we'll make $1 trillion and everything will be great. As is always the case with things that simple, it wasn't. I mean, Vox, which has done so much video, just laid off a bunch of its video people. For me, my view is that video is, it matters less whether it makes money. It's now a vital part of the way we tell stories. It is unimaginable to me that you could have a modern news report without video, right? It's unimaginable. I mean, it's hard to believe this has only happened, I mean, for people in television, I'm saying the obvious, but it's unimaginable to me as the leader of a newsroom that when the president says something, you can't show it. Let alone, you know, the turning point for me was the Ebola video. I mean, it was the foreign staff, the videographer we had posted abroad came back with this video of a family that was trying to bring, in Liberia, in Monrovia, that was trying to bring their child into this makeshift hospital that the Americans had set up to treat Ebola victims, and they couldn't get him in, and he was writhing on the floor, and his family was screaming. And I looked at this video, and I'm sure, you know, Ted Koppel and others in television, for them this would have been just a great video, but for me it was, oh my God, I'm used to telling this in 2,000-word stories. This is better than my 2,000-word stories. So for me, video is just a vital part of our journalism now.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we have time for one more question.
So it looks like these days we're learning a lot more about how information and misinformation have influenced you know, people's opinions, especially with regards to politics in this recent election. And my understanding is that a lot of these people attain this information through social media these days, and these social media organizations are saying, we're not media organizations and we don't have a responsibility to filter this content for our users. Now, how do you think, what kind of responsibility, if any, do you think these organizations like Facebook and Twitter have to filter out misinformation, particularly because they're trying to avoid perceptions of partisan bias to their users while also respecting their users' rights to freedom of expression?
Yeah. My own view, and this is not an opinion in terms of an opinion that has to be on the opinion page, this is just one editor. I mean, I think Facebook is a media company. I mean, I've had conversations with Facebook executives where they describe what they do, and I had a conversation like that with a very senior Facebook executive, and I said to him, "You do exactly the same thing I do." Not really, but they edit. They try to figure out what to present to people. Well, that's sort of what I do. I think they're a media company. I think if they make that acknowledgement, a lot of things come with that. There are responsibilities that you have when you're a media company. All of the issues that you all have heard me grappling with, I think they're going to have to grapple in a different way, of course. But I don't think you can escape the fact that they're now, I mean, there are parts of the world where Facebook is the internet. I don't think you can make the kinds of decisions they make. And by the way, I'm sympathetic to the struggle. It's my struggle too. But I don't think you can make the kinds of decisions they make without acknowledging that you're sort of a media company, Just like I'm a media company, I'm a newspaper company, but as you pointed out in the beginning, I'm also sort of a technology company, right? I mean, a lot of my future depends on my institution's ability to solve some technological problems. I'm a media company, but I got a big technological portfolio, and I think they're sort of some version of the opposite. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.